Hi class, back to our discussion. This one's going to be on the 1980s, and so we're dealing with the Reagan administration, the Reagan years. This is chapter 29, if you're keeping up with that, and this is going to be a transformative decade. We're going to see the end of the Iranian hostage crisis. We're going to see a lot of changes that happen in the direction of conservatism in America, and that's going to be the key hallmark of this, the rise of conservatism, the technological innovations, the cultural shifts, the end of the Cold War. All of this happens in the 1980s. So let's take a closer look at the politics, the economics, and social movements that's going to shape this era. Now, in 1980, we're going to see the rise of former actor and former Democrat Ronald Reagan. He's now in 1980 running as a Republican. He had been former governor of the state of California, and again, as an actor, was fairly well known, although probably never at the top of the popularity game, but he was well known. Played in a lot of westerns in the 1950s. And Reagan's election in 1980 marked the shift from liberal policies in the mid-20th century to a focus on limited government, free market economics, and a strong anti-communist stance. So we kind of come out of that. We're still kind of in that Cold War period that we had talked about a little bit in the past. Now, central to Reagan's presidency is his economic policy. Sometimes it's called Reaganomics. This included tax cuts, deregulation, and the reduction in government spending paired with an increase in military budgets. Cut taxes and businesses grow, but we're also building up a military to show peace through strength. The Soviet Union is still our global enemy, and if we've got a military strong enough to deal with them, then the idea is you're not going to be messed with. While supporters credited Reaganomics with reducing inflation and sparking economic growth, because inflation was bad in the early part of the 80s, the stagflation of the 1970s and maybe even part of the 60s, it begins to increase, but it takes a while. It's going to be a painful early few years in the 1980s, but critics are going to point out that we're going to see an increase in inequality and a ballooning national debt as well as we build up the military to potential face-off against the Soviet Union. Now, Reagan's foreign policy emphasizes a hardline stance against the Soviet Union and the USSR. He even called it the evil empire in one of his speeches. And his administration poured billions into defense spending, including something that was rather controversial. It was called the Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI. Critics called it Star Wars. That movie had just come out in 1977, and I think there was another one in 1981. And so the idea of building a missile defense system in space seemed incredibly far-fetched. Well, the Soviet Union try to keep up. They try to spend money to match our spending. They're not going to be able to do it. At the end of the day, it is going to bring down the Soviet Union. By the mid-1980s, tensions are beginning to ease. Reagan even goes to the Soviet Union to meet with Mikhail Gorbachev, the leader of the Soviet Union, and their agreements on arms reduction are going to pave the way to the end of the Cold War. In fact, we could have got rid of nuclear weapons altogether. If Reagan had given up SDI, he wouldn't do it. And so it kind of stalls that. The problem is the technology's out there, and anyone can use that technology now, the knowledge of, to build nuclear weapons. Reagan said we need a defense. The SDI never happens, but it is, again, going to force the Soviet Union to increase spending, and that increased spending is eventually going to bring them down. By 1989, the Berlin Wall is going to fall. It's going to symbolize the collapse of communist regimes across Eastern Europe. And again, I don't think that's something we really talked much about in previous videos. That's a reason why it's very important to go into the history and not just rely on videos. But again, what is the purpose? Brief overviews. Just keep that in mind. Now, the 1980s are going to bring significant cultural changes. Technology begins to transform American life with the rise of personal computers like Apple, IBM, are some of the big companies there. At the same time, cable television and channels like MTV are going to revolutionize entertainment. It's going to create icons like Michael Jackson and Madonna. And also in the 1980s, we're going to see a national scare that comes out of the LGBT community, and that's going to be the AIDS epidemic. Marginalized community, we could say, but it's also going to show the exposed gaps in health coverage. So this had begun in that community, but it's a sexually transmitted disease, and it begins to spread beyond it. And it's kind of a scary time in the early part of the 1980s. 1980s, you're going to see the rise of the religious right. Groups like the Moral Majority, led by Jerry Falwell, is going to play a significant role in shaping politics, advocating traditional family roles, also in opposition to abortion, and also LGBT stuff as well. Because again, they're focusing on traditional man-woman marriage. and that's the moral majority. Now, at the same time, Reagan's policies are going to face opposition from civil rights groups and feminist groups who pretty much just say that he's not doing enough to focus on their cause. But again, he's focusing on economics and military and things like that. Now, the stock market in the 80s, we're going to start to see a shift, a solidified shift towards a global economy. We're going to see the rise of the Wall Street culture. It's going to mark deregulation, high-stakes trading. We're going to see immense wealth. But as any time you see one group that's getting very, very wealthy, others will, of course, be left behind. I don't know how you solve that problem. Well, Reagan didn't know either. Now, the decade also is going to see increased American involvement in global conflicts, like conflicts in Latin America, where U.S. policies are often going to support authoritarian regimes under the guise of combating communism, because they may be authoritarian. They may not be nice people, but they're not communist, and so we're going to support them. Like in Nicaragua or the Iranian-Contra affair. There's some scandals that do come out of the Reagan administration, and that would be one of them. Now, the 1980s, it's going to be a decade of contradictions. Economic growth is going to be paired with inequality, cultural innovation with social challenges, global leadership, and uncertainty, because, again, we're in a new spot. Reagan's presidency is going to leave a lasting legacy. And in fact, up until the last few years, I would say that Reagan has sort of been this sort of conservative icon, and will remain to be seen whether he's going to hold that compared to future presidents. Are there going to be presidents more conservative than he? We'll kind of see how that plays out in the coming years. But thanks for joining me on this fascinating chapter. This is my childhood. I wasn't paying much attention in those days, but it's interesting to look back at Reagan's presidency, just a brief overview, no matter how brief, and sort of look at some of the big overarching umbrella concepts from that period of time. So reach out to me if you need anything. Give me a thumbs up if this has been helpful, and I'll see you on the next video.